John-Sue and I will take you through this presentation in the next few minutes. Next slide, please. So I personally have been involved in a worker rights campaign for some years against Uber, which came to a head just last month. We finally won our case after 6 years to establish that we had basic employment rights in the United Kingdom. That case went to the Supreme Court. But part of that, through that battle, I began to really understand how important it was to have access to data, to understand algorithmic performance management that may be happening that you may not be aware of, because these are important vectors for asserting your worker rights. So in this gig economy, digital rights and worker rights go hand in hand. And so when we think about data, I was struck by what Anouk was saying about a trade union for data stewardship. I think about it the other way around. I think about data access and data transparency as a tool for organizing labor. And, you know, it's so important to go to the pain points, to make it meaningful, to make this struggle meaningful. And this picture is a picture of all the work that I ever did for Uber. You can see the red is the slow speeds, the lighter colors are the higher speeds. But this is the story of our work. And this is what makes it meaningful for people on the ground. What was their daily struggle? What was the work like? What were the problems that they had? Next slide, please. And so Worker Info Exchange is formed to do that, to try and tilt the balance in favor of workers. You know that companies like Uber succeed because they play a game of regulatory arbitrage, but they also play a game of financial domination through massive amounts of venture capital that are applied into these markets. But most importantly, they play a game of asymmetry of information and data and power between workers and themselves. They have all, you have none. And we think if we can help workers collectivize their data, we can build real collective power. We can tilt the balance in our favor. Next slide, please. So a lot of you'll have heard a lot about the problems of misclassification. On the left-hand side, a lot of our Supreme Court case was built around legal issues about contractual misclassification, having us sign contracts that say we were entrepreneurs, that Uber is not a transport company, it's a technology company. The court decided that these contracts were, I quote, faintly ridiculous, acts of fiction, and so on. So that is over. Those types of contracts. The Supreme Court has ruled there's nowhere else to go on it. What's happening now is companies like Uber are doubling down on algorithmic management. And that's what makes our struggle all the more important now. Next slide, please. Yeah, if I went through this, we'll go through the next slide. So what are we talking about in terms of management control? What are the key pain points for workers? Work allocation. Is the allocation of work fair? Am I getting my fair share? Am I really performing in an open marketplace here? Or could it be that work has been throttled back to me and I'm operating with one hand behind my back? Performance management. Am I being performance managed? If I am, I'm not really free. I'm in an employment relationship and I can assert some rights. It's really important to know if there's some aspect of performance management going on. And thirdly, surveillance. We see a real arms race in the surveillance technology in the gig economy at the moment. And a lot of this is to do with algorithmic performance management, anti-fraud detection, and also for regulatory requirements. But it's worrying because it's the application of very sensitive technology against a workforce that are already chronically denied their rights, and there are no appropriate safeguards. So we need to be watching that carefully. Next slide, please. And so let's deal with work allocation really quickly. This is what Uber tells us about work allocation. It's the closest person gets the job. If you believe that, I've got some land to sell you in Florida. Please message me. I'd love to sell it to you. Next slide, please. This is a message that would suggest something otherwise. This is a message Uber says to drivers. Look, you know, you don't have to accept the work we give you. You can do what you like. But remember, if you don't accept the work, you might be waiting longer for work in future. So this is absolutely contradicting what Uber has already said to us, that its only location is what decides work. We know there's much more in that work allocation decision than that. Next slide, please. And indeed, the number 3 platform tells us there are much more things that go into the work allocation decision, including your previous acceptance rates, your cancellation history, your performance in the past, and really controversially, a fraud probability score, that they decide what is your propensity to break the rules in the future. This is really scary, that this type of a calculation is being made about every single driver, but that there is no transparency to how that score is made up and what it is. Next slide, please. The same with the ratings. You know the game, 1 star to 5 star. Unfortunately, there's really only, it looks like it's a 5 star system, but it's binary, because you can see from these descriptors that come from Uber, there's only one answer, and that's 5. And in fact, you lose your job at 4.4 stars. Next slide, please. And also hidden performance management. We know that this goes on too, that there are profiles that Uber keeps that they do not disclose, including attaching tags that you've got a negative attitude. In this case, for example, I refused a job that was 14 minutes away. Next slide, please. And then finally, there's regulatory pressure for stepping up surveillance. Is this even legal? There's some really serious issues about this, certainly no safeguards in place. Next slide, please. And this is an actual case, which we'll be speaking about in the coming days. This is a single driver, it's the same person. I know that can be difficult to tell sometimes, but that's the nature of the issue. But this person was deactivated and had his public license revoked. It's all been reversed, but it's an example of how unreliable this technology is and the devastating effects it can have. Next slide, please. So I'm going to hand over here to my good colleague, Chan Soon. I'll be back a little later.
Thank you, James. Can we move on to the next slide, please? Yeah, so as James mentioned, our mission is to tip the balance from platforms to workers, and we intend to do this by facilitating the access to data to create algorithmic transparency and challenge unfair automated decisions. Next slide, please. So what does the battleground for data access look like? Well, we've identified 3 layers of data that we're targeting with our requests. First, we have the data entered by the workers, data provided by the data subject. This is the easiest category of data to obtain. There's no dispute or uncertainty over this. The second layer of data is the data that is observed by the machine. This is usually raw data such as geolocation, speed, customer ratings, telematics, and so on. This data can be thought of as the mechanism through which Uber measures and surveils the drivers. And finally, we have the inferred or derived data. This is the real battleground of data access. It's through this data that Uber profiles, makes classifications, and automated decisions about drivers. We found out that Uber attaches electronic tags as well to driver profiles such as attitude, behavior, and lateness. These form the basis of Uber's performance management. So Uber is very resistant to sharing this data. Next slide, please. And why do we need this data? Well, there are 4 initial questions that this data will answer that workers have, which are: how much were they paid? How their time and vehicle was utilized? What the quality and quantity of the work was? How they were allocated jobs? And if they were deactivated or suspended, why? Next slide, please. Finally, to talk a little bit about how we're going to do this, well, we need to do it in batch requests, we need to get power of attorney, and we need to ensure secure authentication of drivers' identities. Often, to frustrate drivers, companies prolong these verification checks and correspondence, which means that work grows exponentially around data requests. And working with others, we found that we need to follow an iterative process in developing this work and creating an efficient system around these 3 conditions. And our first goal is to find the specific resistant points of these rideshare platforms. So by setting up the system, we're trying to establish a standard and consistent format of disclosure. This, of course, is aided by our strategic litigation work, which James will talk about in a moment. But in the meantime, next slide, please. Our goal is to reach 1,000 gig workers, to make 1,000 data subject access requests. So if you come into contact with any Uber drivers, tell them to sign up. Thank you.
And next slide, please. And so we have some ongoing litigation at the moment that is related to these three layers of access, transparency, and automated decision making. And we've just got a very important decision from the courts in the Netherlands yesterday. And I can take you through that because it's really very relevant for issues of stewardship. Firstly, the court threw out Uber and Ola's arguments that we should not have the right to access the data for the purposes of a data trust. Both those platforms had argued that this was an abuse of rights, abuse of the GDPR process. The court threw that out on its ear, which was fantastic. And the court also recognized that we should have that access. But in terms of access, we lost some ground. Uber was able to convince the court that it needed to better balance the rights of passengers versus drivers, but we think we have important grounds of appeal. So we may see some blurring of data around pickup and drop-off points, which may get in the way of a more accurate picture of movement and cost. But I think these are issues we can overcome. But there's really magnificent breakthrough on algorithmic transparency. Both Uber and Ola were ordered to provide transparency under their surveillance system, the Guardian system, and Uber's real-time identification system that was involved in that misidentification in the photo recognition I just talked to you about. Ola was ordered to disclose the fraud probability score that we talked about, and also the earnings profile, because these profiles are used in decision making around work allocation. And finally, what's really important for automated decision making is that the court, we believe this is the first time in Europe that this has happened, the court recognized that the gig platform was making automated decisions related to pay deductions for one driver. And that's really significant because it shows there's automated decision making going on in the management of a gig worker, and that attracts new rights, including the right to appeal and the right to a proper explanation of what's going on. And we also additionally had an order that Uber had to explain and provide the data related to at least two deactivations in the test cases. Next slide, please, and then I better wrap it up. So lessons learned in this work: overcoming resistance. It really takes time and patience and overall good design in how we set up the process for access requests, but also how we design stewardship of trust going forward. Likewise, achieving algorithmic transparency is going to take an iterative approach. It's going to be peeling an onion. The more we learn we don't know, and the more we can target that over time. That approach will take time. And the data trust must address the stakeholder immediate interest. This is what I was going back to when I talked about that picture of the data. It's so important that we address the pain points that workers on the ground are facing today. We're discovering insights about their data that will help them assert their rights. And finally, achieving this critical mass is so important because it puts on a lot of pressure on these platforms, but it also gives us a richer data set. And that's why we've made this target of 1,000. I think that's it. I'm over time. Thank you very much for listening.